$9,000 if I hadn't contacted 730.
We're not in the business of spreading a virus.
Why do you think they didn't want you to win an election?
Because they thought I would win it.
If the virus doesn't get you, the economic fallout will.
I was hell-bent on proving people wrong.
Why all the secrecy?
Lee, I'm just focused on the Australian people.
7:30, Monday to Thursday, ABC and iView.
For a complete breakdown of election results, head to abc.net.au/ACT votes. See what happened in your electorate, get all the latest news, and know the story. Find the most extensive post-election guide at abc.net.au/ACT votes.
Good evening. It's Wednesday, the 21st of October. Our top stories tonight. Japan's new Prime Minister shores up security alliances in Southeast Asia in his first overseas trip. Vietnam braces for more storms after dozens were killed in floods and landslides. 3 killed as a powerful blast rips through a building in Karachi. And Thailand welcomes its first foreign tourists since the pandemic began. You're watching The World. Also tonight, we're going to delve into who's behind the mysterious Havana syndrome. Well, Japan's new Prime Minister is using his first overseas visit to shore up support in Southeast Asia against the backdrop of China's growing assertiveness in the region. Yoshihide Suga is in Indonesia, where he's held talks with the President, Joko Widodo. Maritime disputes in the South China Sea was high on the agenda in Jakarta, also in Hanoi. Earlier this week, Mr Suga signed a landmark deal to export Japanese military equipment to Vietnam. And there's little doubt the deal would be raising eyebrows in Beijing, as Yvonne Yong reports.
Yoshihide Suga's visit to Indonesia is part of Japan's efforts to bolster ties with key regional countries amid concerns about China's growing assertiveness in the region.
Japan is opposed to any actions that escalate tension in the South China Sea. Let me stress the importance of all the parties concerning the South China Sea issues not to resort to force or coercion, but work towards peaceful resolutions of the disputes based on international law.
The newly installed leader, on the second leg of his first overseas trip, held talks with Indonesian President Joko Widodo, who also reiterated his commitment to maintaining peace in the contested maritime region.
I also underlined my hope that the South China Sea can continue to be a sea of peace and stability.
There are multiple territorial disputes over islands that may be resource-rich in the South China Sea. Disagreements are mainly between China and smaller governments such as Vietnam, Malaysia and Taiwan. And they've been fighting over this territory for decades, but in recent years the tension has increased. Mr Suga's trip is aimed at conveying that its respect for a rules-based international system, in contrast to China, which refuses to recognise tribunal rulings against its vast sea claims, makes Japan the better partner for Southeast Asian countries.
They're going to be important partners for managing some of the South China Sea issues. They're going to be important partners in terms of trade and economy. And they're going to be important partners for reshaping ASEAN so that it's a more effective partner to deal with some of the challenges in the region.
The two leaders also agreed to strengthen bilateral defence ties. It comes after a landmark deal to export Japanese military equipment to Vietnam. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
And authorities in Vietnam and the Philippines are bracing for another tropical storm that could cause heavy flooding and mudslides. The death toll in Vietnam from weeks of unrelenting rain has risen to more than 100, with dozens of people still missing. Floods have blocked roads and cut power, leaving people stranded without food or fresh water. Soldiers are evacuating people to higher ground. The Red Cross says it's the worst flooding in the region for years and will push millions of people towards the brink of poverty. And we'll talk with the Red Cross in the region in just a few minutes. Well, a powerful blast has ripped through a multi-storey building in Pakistan's southern port city of Karachi, killing at least 3 people and wounding 15. Many were still trapped under rubble when emergency services got to the scene, with rescuers rushing to remove the debris to save them. It's not clear what caused the explosion, but authorities believe it may have been sparked by a cooking gas canister on the second floor. An investigation is still underway. A US Marine says Australian Special Forces shot dead a bound prisoner while on a raid in Afghanistan. The helicopter crew chief says the Afghan was unlawfully killed after the commandos were told he would not fit on the US aircraft coming to pick them up. The alleged killing took place during a joint Australian-US raid targeting drug networks that were funding the Taliban. Mark Willesee from ABC Investigations with this exclusive report.
This former crew chief for the US Marines Attack Helicopter Squadron flew more than 150 missions in Afghanistan. He has allowed the ABC to show his face, but has asked that we don't use his real name because he fears retribution. The crew chief says he did more than a dozen missions with Australian Special Forces from the 2 Commando Regiment, targeting Taliban drug networks.
They would get dropped off and they would immediately be sprinting off the aircraft, blowing up walls, capturing people, killing people, and then taking whatever prisoners they had back with them.
The former crew chief was a helicopter door gunner on a night raid with the commandos in northern Helmand province in mid-2012, in which the Australians had taken prisoners.
We just watched them hogtie these guys, and we knew their hands were, tied behind their backs.
He says the Australians called the US pilots to pick them up, as well as 7 prisoners. But the pilot told them there was only room on the aircraft for 6.
And you just heard a silence, and then we heard a pop, and then they said, okay, we have 6 prisoners. And so it was pretty apparent to everybody involved in that mission that they had just killed a prisoner, that we had just watched them catch and hogtie.
The former Marines crew chief says after hearing the gunshot, none of the Americans on the helicopters supporting the Australian commandos said a word because they knew their communications were being recorded. It was only later, back at their base, that they talked about what had happened on the ground.
This isn't like a heat of the moment call where you're trying to make a decision. It was a very deliberate decision to break the rules of war. And everybody else, I felt, would step on the lines, but the Aussies would just see the line and just hop right over it.
A report into alleged war crimes by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan is expected to be released in the coming weeks by the Inspector General of Defence. In response to questions about the killing of a bound prisoner, Defence said it could not comment while the Inspector General was still investigating. Mark Willesee, ABC News.
Soldiers in Nigeria have been accused of opening fire on protesters as residents rallied against alleged police brutality and corruption. Eyewitness footage captured protesters running in the Lekki district of the commercial capital Lagos as gunfire rang out.
Please tell people, people are having to run. They're shooting at them at the Lekki toll gate. Please tell social media.
No deaths or injuries have yet been confirmed, but the state government has opened an investigation. For 2 weeks, Nigerians across the country have been calling for law reforms, despite the disbanding of a controversial police unit accused of extortion, harassment and even murder. A 24-hour curfew has been imposed on Nigeria's largest city, Lagos, after an earlier curfew on Benin City. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has urged citizens to remain cautious ahead of the festival season over concerns coronavirus will surge again in the country. In his televised address to the nation, Mr Modi urged people to continue taking precautions to maintain physical distancing and not lower their guard. Faced with a stalled economy, India has been slowly opening up. Over the past month, the country has seen a trend of declining cases on a week-to-week basis, even though the overall virus caseload is near 7.6 million. In a controversial first, British researchers are preparing to infect healthy young volunteers with the virus that causes COVID-19. Now, the aim is to try and study the disease and potentially speed up development of a vaccine. Nick Dole is in London.
Before the pandemic, Robert Hatfield was selling chocolate to the masses. Now he's volunteering to catch the virus for them too.
If you can do something and you can help, then that's something that I'm willing to do.
There are dozens of vaccines in the testing phase, but waiting for participants to be naturally exposed to COVID-19 takes time. So UK scientists plan to deliberately infect healthy volunteers between 18 and 30 years of age.
The probabilities of me dying or anything is very, very low. And so when I think about what society gains by getting a vaccine sooner, I'm not that worried about the risks.
It's at this hospital in London that scientists will determine how much virus it takes to infect someone with COVID-19. The volunteers will be given a dose as a nasal drop, then treated with the antiviral drug remdesivir as soon as they're infected. Once an appropriate dose is identified, scientists could run a series of trials testing several vaccines.
And that's really the end point of the study, is not them getting high fever or hypoxic or anything of that sort. We're hoping not to see that at all because we're starting with such small, cautious doses.
Volunteers can expect to stay in hospital for at least a fortnight and be paid about $8,000. There are ethical issues because the long-term effects of the virus remain unclear, but not acting has its own ethical implications.
Some people will give a kidney to a stranger. Some people will give their lives for their country. I think it's entirely reasonable to allow people to be altruistic, especially when their sacrifices could save hundreds of thousands of lives over the next months.
The study still needs regulatory approval. If it gets the go-ahead, scientists will start infecting volunteers in January, with results expected by May next year. Nick Dole, ABC News, London.
Thailand has welcomed its first batch of foreign tourists since the pandemic led to a ban on commercial flights in April. The 39 visitors from China arrived at the country's main airport in Bangkok, but were seemingly undeterred by escalating protests. It comes as authorities declare the capital to be in a state of emergency as thousands rally against the government, demanding reforms to the monarchy. Thailand's tourism minister says the travellers will have to take precautionary measures before being allowed to tour the country.
They'll be quarantined for 7 days inside their hotel rooms and another 7 days within the hotel compound. After that, they'll be able to move to other destinations within Thailand. Winter is coming, so more tourists from Europe, the United States, Korea and Japan would also like to come visit us around this time.
Well, let's return to Vietnam, where authorities are rushing to evacuate residents from flooded areas as Tropical Storm Sordell closes in. Christopher Rassi is the acting head of the International Federation of Red Crosses delegation in Bangkok, but he joins us live out of Stockholm, where he's been monitoring events. Christopher, good to have you with us. Give us a sense of the impact this flooding has had in Vietnam.
Thanks, Bev. I'm happy to join you. This has been some of the worst flooding and storms we've seen in over 2 decades right now in central Vietnam. We're talking about over 5 million people affected, 200,000 homes submerged, a loss of life of over 100 right now, which is devastating. And we're seeing food crops swamped, hundreds of thousands of livestock and poultry killed and swept away. It's and we're still seeing the search and rescue, which is critical right now, needed more than ever. So that's what the authorities, the Vietnam Red Cross and the government authorities are really working on, getting to those people that need it most, and continuing the evacuations and getting those people that need to be brought to safety by land, by air, and by road, when infrastructure is so severely affected right now.
Yes, and so and sort of vulnerable anyway. And when you talk of that damage to livestock and crops in a country like Vietnam that faces such poverty, what might that mean once the recovery is underway?
But as you know, Vietnam, like many other countries and communities in those countries, are dealing with a double disaster right now, and the economic impacts of COVID-19. So loss of livelihoods, loss of income, especially in central Vietnam, loss of tourism right now at a critical time. And so here you have that, and then you have this devastation that's just which is a double disaster right now. And so we are working with the authorities and Vietnam Red Cross is on the ground right now trying to provide cash assistance. And that's one of the, providing that livelihood support right now to those most affected. And that's what really, so in addition to search and rescue, in addition to providing shelter, clean water, food, and other forms of assistance, providing that extra, the livelihood assistance, which is crucial for these communities.
So when you talk of cash assistance, that's the best way to help in a way, because it's what they need most. It's not necessarily goods at the moment.
Communities know what they need, and with the cash assistance, they can get what they need. They can get what they're missing, and so we provide some emergency support and some cash, and that really is what we believe, and it's worked extremely well in Vietnam during COVID-19 as well, and we're continuing with that right now.
How might this set back the government in terms of managing the pandemic? They've actually managed it fairly well. The cases have been very limited.
Yes. I think even the most prepared and resilient communities that can't cope with this. And that's really what we have to look at. How are communities coping? How can the authorities, how can we, as the Red Cross, both in Vietnam and internationally, help communities cope and restore their dignity in such times of crisis? And that's what we have to look at as well. We have to, so yes, Vietnam has managed COVID-19 extremely well. But with this, we also have to really focus on the economic impacts and how these communities will be able to rebound, which will definitely affect them. And we have to take that into account for in longer term planning as well.
Christopher, good to have you with us and bringing us up to date. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bev.
Well, new clashes between Azeri and ethnic Armenian forces has again put a ceasefire in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh under strain. Both sides are blaming each other for violating the new ceasefire agreement, but neither side are willing to stand down.
We will win anyway, and this will continue until we reach our point. Everything is very simple. This is our home, and we will stay here anyway.
The second attempt at a truce has had little impact on fighting that began last month, despite concerns it could erupt into an all-out war involving Russia and Turkey. Internet giant Google is being sued by American regulators accused of abusing its market dominance. The US Justice Department and 11 states are accusing the company of stifling competition in online searches and advertising. But Google says the case is deeply flawed and people use its search engine because they choose to, not because they have to.
I think this is going to be a long battle, but ultimately I think this is a first step in what's going to be, I think, many chapters against big tech.
The case follows a year-long investigation into Google. It could open the way for other court action, with politicians in Congress calling for similar action against Amazon, Facebook and Apple. The WA government is doubling down against pressure to partially reopen the interstate borders, saying the headaches posed by the New Zealand travel bubble demonstrate just why that is a bad idea. It came as the government backed away from suggestions that freight vessels with COVID outbreaks on board could be sent back out to sea.
It's the reopening WA says demonstrates why the state can't pursue its own border bubble arrangements.
The events of this week bring it into sharp focus that a travel bubble is, by its very definition, easily popped.
As Kiwis flock into Australia via the international border bubble with New Zealand, they've been heading to all corners of the country, including WA, which isn't part of the arrangement. And as the Health Minister faced a budget estimates grilling on the interstate border closure, he insisted the New Zealand experience showed the trouble with a bubble.
People are incredibly inventive. And as a result of that, they will do and say a range of things to circumvent jurisdictions and the rules that they have in place.
It's a different tone to a week ago when the Chief Health Officer talked up the possibility of a partial border reopening to states with no community spread. And the opposition isn't buying the latest explanation.
I thought it was a pretty shambolic effort and a terrible display of transparency or lack thereof from the Health Minister.
The border dominated that estimates hearing, but it's not the only major COVID issue the state is facing. With outbreaks on ships a growing concern, the Premier has threatened to turn around freight vessels with infected crew members on board. But that call has angered industry, and the Health Minister has poured cold water on the idea.
obviously we have a moral and to some extent a legal responsibility to look after the sick and the unwell.
With infected seafarers from the Almasilla now in hotel quarantine, the Health Minister says that ship is set to stay in port until enough of them recover for it to depart. While the 2 crew members from the Key Integrity to test positive remain on that vessel. Jacob Kagi, ABC News.
Australian Federal Police say they've passed information to the Victorian anti-corruption body about allegations of money being transferred from the Vatican in relation to the trial of Cardinal George Pell. Earlier this year, the High Court quashed Cardinal Pell's child sexual abuse convictions. This month, Italian media published claims that hundreds of thousands of euros were transferred to Australia in relation to the case. The AFP is reviewing the information that it has received. Now to a phenomenon that has continued to challenge scientists and governments alike, and no, it is not coronavirus. In 2016, staff at the US Embassy in Cuba began experiencing a multitude of neurological symptoms. Since then, similar problems have occurred in several other countries, including even in Australia. It's called Havana syndrome, and those who've had it are demanding an investigation into whether it's caused by a microwave-based attack. Julia Ioffe is a journalist who covers national security and foreign policy issues for GQ magazine. She joins us live from Washington, D.C. Julia, great to have you with us. You've been looking at this most intriguing and perplexing story. Give us some background as to how it has been impacting embassy staff around the world.
Hi, Beverly. Thank you so much for having me. So, as you said, it started in late 2016. It first hit American diplomats and American spies posing as diplomats in Havana. And basically, some people heard a sound, some people didn't hear anything. But people started coming down with debilitating vertigo, nausea, sleeplessness, inability to concentrate. A lot of people couldn't work anymore. That it led to the embassy being basically shut down in Havana and derailing the kind of détente with between America and Cuba. Then the same phenomenon popped up in China, in the consulate in Guangzhou, and then incidents in Shanghai. And now we know that these, what we think are now attacks from directed energy weapons that cause these this damage to the brain have been happening in Georgia, Poland, London, Australia now, Taiwan, and now at home on U.S. soil.
So far more widespread than initially thought. Take us through again just what we understand when you're talking about a microwave-based attack. What sort of weapon is that?
So it's a directed energy weapon, as far as we understand. It directs electromagnetic radiation, apparently, at the brain, and it causes damage to from what we understand, damage to the white matter. That's the deeper part of the brain where all the kind of wiring, networking is in the brain. And that's the part of the brain that doesn't regrow, doesn't replace itself. And so some of this damage is permanent.
So the belief from those that have been attacked or have suffered is that it is a foreign actor involved in this. And the fingers are being pointed at Russia. What have your investigations uncovered?
So I should also say, by the way, about the weapon, the U.S. also has this kind of weapon, but it's very large from what we've seen.
Yes.
From my reporting has found that it's gotten a lot smaller. It's portable. You can beam it through walls, through windows, and up to a couple miles away. From what I have found, CIA investigators have correlated the travel of agents from the FSB, or the Russian security services, that places these agents in and around the space where people were attacked. These are CIA officers who were attacked around the same time, including in Australia. In 2 instances where CIA officers were attacked, the FSB agents were actually in the same hotel at the same time that the attacks occurred. So this is not a slam dunk case just yet, but it is the beginning of an investigation that CIA investigators hoped the agency would pick up and run with, but it has been basically squashed, they believe, because the leadership is too scared to bring anything Russia-related to our president.
Yes, I want to talk about that in a minute, but these attacks also happened in Russia, admittedly against US diplomats, US officials. Could that have been a deliberate ploy to distract attention from Russia as a perpetrator?
No, I think if anything, it, points the finger at the Russians, that it happens on Russian soil. Russia controls what happens on its territory pretty carefully. And the fact that it was aimed at 2 CIA officers who were working at the time on a new effort to push back against Russian covert actions and active measures, really kind of seems like it would be the Russians, wouldn't it?
It is funny because Russia still seems to just have this real Cold War mentality without presuming that they are guilty in this instance. As you say, it's not a slam dunk, but they do seem to be the foreign actor that acts in this Cold War mentality.
Yes, and, as a lot of people that I spoke to about this who work on this issue, they don't understand why Russia is still doing this. They want us to, in some ways, they hate that they've become this third rail of American politics, but they kind of love that they're this boogeyman that everybody's talking about, that they're feared. They know they're not going to be loved by the Americans, but might as well be feared and respected, and have their opinion taken into account on the world stage. When they're in this Cold War mentality, what that means for them is that they're still a superpower and that they're still treated like a superpower with the respect and awe that they think they deserve.
It's ironic, though, because as you pointed out, is Donald Trump has not been willing to take on the Russians. If they say they weren't involved, he just simply says they say they weren't involved. I believe them. So it is interesting that they've chosen to do it over this period of time when Trump has been in power and not really scrutinising them.
That's right. Well, I think that there's also people, in the Russian security agencies who just do this. They're used to doing this. They've been doing this for decades. And until they meet resistance or some kind of pushback or somebody slapping them on the hand, they're going to keep going further and further and further. In 2019, as I found in my reporting, they were slipping date rape drugs in the drinks of CIA officers who were at receptions in American embassies. I mean, that's crazy.
It is completely crazy. Are the people, at least, who suffered, the diplomats, the CIA officials, have they been given compensation? Have they been treated seriously?
Not really, unfortunately. Our government is not really doing much for the people affected. This is the reason the main, character in my story, Mark Polymeropoulos, who was a very senior CIA official, the equivalent of a 4-star general. This is the reason he spoke out. He got no, basically doctors inside the CIA telling him he's crazy. This is what's happening to State Department officials, Commerce Department officials who have been affected. They're not getting the treatment or the support that they deserve while being hit on the job, doing their duties, representing the American government. And they're deeply frustrated.
Yes, well, in 2 weeks' time may change things, but I guess we'll have to wait and see the outcome of the US election. Julia, fascinating. We really appreciate getting the benefit of your investigations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, there's been another blow to the aviation industry with Cathay Pacific Airways announcing it'll slash nearly 6,000 jobs. The Hong Kong carrier is also ending its regional Cathay Dragon brand, which operated most of the group's flights to and from mainland China. The restructure will see changes to contracts with cabin crew and pilots. The airline is the latest that has been forced to cut costs as it grapples with the fallout of the pandemic. The Danish man convicted of killing a Swedish journalist in his homemade submarine in 2017 has been recaptured after he briefly broke out of jail. Police say Peter Madsen used a fake gun and a bomb belt to hold a worker hostage and forced his way out of the prison where he's serving a life sentence for killing journalist Kim Wall. He was arrested less than a kilometre from prison 5 minutes after police were alerted to his escape. Type 2 diabetes is one of the most common chronic diseases in Australia and many parts of Asia, but where you live or how much money you make can affect what medication you're given. In what's been described as a postcode lottery, new research has found Australians in remote and poorer areas are more likely to be using older and less effective diabetes drugs than their city counterparts. Here's Stephanie Dalziel.
Let's check the blood sugar today.
Technology has helped bridge the healthcare divide between city dwellers and people in remote areas. But Gay Gillies knows all too well some gaps remain.
I have enough problems going to specialists and that. I've got a 2-hour drive.
The 71-year-old lives just outside Proserpine in far north Queensland. A diabetic for 3 decades, she was only put on new, more effective medication 12 months ago, despite the drug being readily available for several years in urban areas.
Not very happy. It's, a bit daunting, to think, oh, well, we're out there, don't worry about us.
Gay Gillies is just one of more than 1.2 million Australians with type 2 diabetes, tracked by researchers at the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute between 2007 and 2015. They found people in remote and lower socioeconomic areas are far more likely to be using older and less effective medication than those in richer and metropolitan regions. That's a problem because older medication can come with a higher risk of complications, including heart and kidney disease.
It shouldn't matter where you live. It shouldn't matter how wealthy or otherwise your suburb is. Everybody should be entitled to the same interventions and the same medication.
This study is really important because, once again, we've got some evidence to show that this postcode lottery is real. It is absolutely real. It shows that there are certainly differences depending on where people live.
In poorer and remote areas, there are typically fewer health services, meaning resources are stretched. While in some towns there are no specialists, leaving overworked GPs to oversee diabetic care. The federal government is trying to encourage more doctors to move away from metropolitan areas and argues it's already providing considerable support through subsidising medications through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Stephanie Dalzell, ABC News, Canberra.
A NASA spacecraft has touched the surface of an asteroid to collect a handful of cosmic rubble that could contain the building blocks of our solar system. The mission team cheered as the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft sent back confirmation of its contact with asteroid Bennu, more than 200 million miles away. It was a first for the United States.
We're safely moving away from the asteroid surface. The spacecraft did everything it was supposed to do. So we did it. We tagged the surface of the asteroid.
It could be a week before scientists know how much surface dust, if any, was grabbed or whether they will need to try again. Asteroid samples from an earlier Japan mission are due to land in the Australian desert in December. Now to what in the world, and the Prime Minister of Iceland can now add unshakable to her list of attributes. Katrín Jakobsdóttir was in the middle of doing a live interview with the Washington Post when an earthquake hit the island nation.
Oh my God, there's an earthquake. Sorry, there was an earthquake right now. Wow. Well, this is Iceland.
And that is keeping you cool. The leader just carrying on with the interview. The Icelandic Met Office said the quake registered magnitude 5.5 with several aftershocks detected. You're watching The World. Our top stories tonight. On his first overseas trip, Japan's new leader says he opposes any actions that escalate tensions in the East and South China Seas. Vietnam and the Philippines brace for more storms after dozens are killed in floods and landslides. And at least 3 people dead after a powerful blast rips through a building in Karachi. Well, at least 15 people have been killed and more than a dozen injured in a stampede caused by a rush to secure visas from the Pakistan consulate in eastern Afghanistan. Officials say 11 of those trampled to death were women and several senior citizens were wounded. Provincial authorities say over 3,000 people had congregated hoping to grab a token needed to apply for the sought-after travel documents. The Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte says he accepts responsibility for the thousands of killings committed during a police crackdown on drugs. He says he's even ready to go to jail. At least 6,000 drug suspects have been killed by police since Mr Duterte took office 4 years ago. Human rights groups have accused authorities of considerably underreporting the deaths. Well, the fiancé of murdered Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi has launched legal action against Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Mr Khashoggi was killed by Saudi agents 2 years ago in the kingdom's consulate in Istanbul. Hatice Cengiz claims the prince ordered the killing. Saudi authorities say he had nothing to do with it. Well, the swift public backlash to the Victorian government's decision to allow 500 people to attend this weekend's Cox Plate has forced an embarrassing about-face. The racing minister, Martin Pakula, has acknowledged his call to have people at the track during Stage 4 lockdown was a mistake. And he says he understands why it made many Melburnians pretty unhappy. Here's state political reporter Bridget Rollison.
Racing Minister Martin Pakula is no stranger to a trackside marquee. But yesterday he failed to read the room.
I was struck by the community reaction. I understood it very clearly. It was a mistake to have initially made that decision.
Within hours of announcing 500 racing owners and connections could attend this weekend's Cox Plate in a city where only 10 mourners are allowed at funerals, the government was forced to make an embarrassing backflip.
What I didn't do well enough was to step back and to see how it would be perceived outside of the racing industry.
Social media had lit up with talk of double standards and Victorians missing out on funerals and family gatherings and postponing a small wedding. And when people are suffering financially and mentally, how insulting and disgraceful the decision was, while questioning the message it sends. Even the owner of the Cox Plate favourite, Russian Camelot, who will now be watching the race at home, described the government's handling of the process as shambolic.
But Russian Camelot's coming clear. He's class.
It set the industry up to be seen as elitist or getting special favours.
Victorians are just sick of the inconsistency and the double standards.
The event would have looked very different to previous Cox Plates, without the close celebrations and no fashions on the field. Instead, 40 owners would have been allowed to come and watch their horse race, then have to leave.
We can have 4,000 people enjoying a day on the lawn in the park 2 blocks away. We're on a 40-hectare site here, so social distancing would have been in place.
The decision was signed off by the Premier and the Chief Health Officer, who again didn't front the media today after being asked to provide more evidence to the hotel quarantine inquiry.
Went through the normal process, but it was the wrong decision. I'll cop that. The right thing to do is to change it. That's what we've done. It won't be happening on Saturday.
After months of turmoil, the astonishing decision appeared to unite the community in anger. Many questioning what on earth the state government was thinking to even entertain the idea during such a fragile time. The next big balancing act for the government will be the Melbourne Cup, which will be held here in less than 2 weeks. Bridget Rollison, ABC News, Melbourne.
Well, let's turn to the Asia Pacific now and a new study that delves into the various factors that contribute to ongoing inequalities between men and women. Research by the Burnett Institute has found that systemic gender inequality kicks in during early adolescence, and the knock-on effect it ends up having on everything from health and safety to education and employment is truly eye-opening. I spoke with Dr. Elissa Kennedy from the Burnett Institute, who outlined exactly what the study involved.
So what we were looking to do was to have a comprehensive analysis of how gender inequality manifests during the really critical formative years of childhood and adolescence. I think for this region, we've had a particular focus on things like child marriage and girls' education. I think that's largely been driven by experiences and needs in South Asia, but perhaps we've made some assumptions about what the inequalities might be in other parts of the region. And we haven't really had a comprehensive understanding of how gender inequality impacts on other areas of health and wellbeing that are really important through the first 2 decades of life. So what we did was look at 87 indicators capturing key aspects of health, education, employment, protection and safety of the environment young people live in, to see where are the inequalities between girls and boys and what age do they start emerging.
So surprisingly, it was a little later than you might have thought. It was really in adolescence. Was that unexpected?
Yeah, I think, we expected to see more differences during childhood, and certainly in a few countries in the region, in South Asia and to some extent East Asia, there was evidence of son preference in very early childhood. But for the majority of countries in the region, there were very few differences in outcomes between girls and boys during childhood. But that's changed quite dramatically from early adolescence. So from around the age of 10 to 14 years, the risks, the outcomes, the opportunities that girls and boys experience become vastly different and persist into later adolescence and also into early adulthood.
So where are the biggest problems across the region, and what are the issues that emerge in that adolescent period?
So for girls compared to boys, in many countries in the region, adolescence brings an increased burden of poor sexual and reproductive health outcomes. In all countries that we looked at, things like child marriage were much more prevalent amongst girls than boys. And there were high rates of adolescent fertility, particularly in South Asia and in some countries of the Pacific. And with that came high maternal mortality rates amongst 15 to 19-year-olds. We also found a high prevalence of sexual and intimate partner violence in a number of countries across the region, and some other issues around a high burden of things like sexually transmitted infections. But beyond sort of sexual and reproductive health, there are broader impacts for girls in the region. While we have largely closed the gaps in education between girls and boys in many countries, girls are not transitioning to further education or training or employment at the same rate that boys are in almost all countries that we had data for.
Boys are not excluded, though, from some risks as well. What sort of issues did you encounter for boys?
Yeah, absolutely. We found a significant gendered pattern of harm that boys, particularly adolescent boys, experience across the region. So in many countries, they had double the mortality rate of adolescent girls. That was largely due to excess preventable deaths due to injury, to violence, so homicide, and also to suicide. They had almost double the rate of suicide in most countries. We also found an increase in risk behaviours such as harmful use of alcohol and tobacco smoking amongst boys when compared to girls.
So I guess the critical issue is, how does it inform policy in the region, and are governments interested to find out how they can impact some of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a real commitment in the region to achieving gender equality. It's a sustainable development goals. Countries have committed themselves to reducing the discrimination and disadvantage that's particularly experienced by women and to a lesser extent girls. So I think this has really highlighted that adolescence in particular is a critical time to address gender inequality. It's when inequalities first start becoming more prominent. It's also a really critical time, that time around puberty, when adolescents are experiencing intense gender socialisation. You know, they're learning about their gender identities, their norms, the roles, the expectations that go with that. So early adolescence is a critical window of opportunity to intervene and to transform some of those gender norms before they become entrenched. The other thing that I think this research has demonstrated is that gender inequality is pervasive. It impacts on a broad range of issues in young people's lives. So I think our approach to gender inequality needs to be a lot broader than it has been in the past. We need to be looking at those other significant negative impacts on girls around economic participation and some emerging health risks in some countries. We also need to be better at reaching boys to reduce the harms that they experience from rigid and harmful gender norms. But I think we also need to recognise that gender impacts on a whole range of outcomes for young people. So our policies and our programs need to understand and consider the gendered impacts that they have. I think we can no longer be sort of gender blind in our approach to adolescent health and wellbeing. To do so, sort of accepting the inequalities as they are and, deciding to do something about it. So I think really to advance gender inequality, to advance gender equality, I should say, and also to improve the lives of young people, we really need to be putting gender and gender equality at the core of what we do.
There are some systemic cultural barriers that exist in many countries, particularly in the Pacific. How do we do it? Through education? Do we have to start really early and a real educational and community transformation?
Yeah, I think, these are really complex issues. And what we're really talking about is transforming deeply embedded, rigid, restrictive norms, and also transforming those systems that predominantly discriminate and cause disadvantage to girls. And that, requires actions at multiple levels, from looking at the legal and policy frameworks that we have, but also community-based action, working with community stakeholders and young people themselves to better understand what's driving these changes and to really try to address the underlying norms and biases and barriers that girls and boys face.
It's a really interesting study. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Well, the former chairman of Crown Resorts is facing possible prosecution after counsel assisting a New South Wales casino inquiry recommended he be referred to the corporate watchdog. Robert Rankin is accused of serious failures during his time at the helm of the gambling giant when it was caught up in a money laundering scandal. Here's Josh Bavis.
The hearing is almost over, and now the chips are falling. While dozens of witnesses have given evidence, one remains outstanding: former chairman Robert Rankin.
He has, through his solicitors, firstly refused to answer any questions posed to him in writing.
Mr Rankin was chairman from 2015 to 17, but is refusing to give evidence in writing or video from the United Kingdom, where he's staying. Counsel assisting has recommended he be referred to the corporate watchdog ASIC for alleged breaches in his duties.
Commissioner, Mr Rankin has been made aware that adverse comment may well be made in respect of his unwillingness to assist the inquiry and or provide any information or evidence to it.
The hearing was told he allegedly failed to inform Crown's board about the risk posed to its staff in China before their arrests in 2016, and allegedly failed to tell the board about a threatening email former director James Packer sent to a businessman. This is the first of such serious referrals to be mentioned in the inquiry to date, and it might not be the last. The Commissioner is now examining the evidence to decide if anyone else should be referred for prosecution, as well as the changes Crown needs to make in order to operate in Sydney. Former Qantas boss and Crown Director Jeff Dixon was the last of the board members to give evidence. Despite being in charge of Crown's Risk Management Committee, he said there was no training for staff to identify risks of money laundering and was kept in the dark about the risks to staff in China before they were arrested.
And were you ever informed at any time up to the China arrests that the staff in China were expressing fears for their safety? No.
It almost brings to a close a hearing that has the power to unravel Australia's newest casino before a single hand is played. Josh Bavis, ABC News, Sydney.
Tributes are flowing tonight for British musician and band leader Spencer Davis, who has died of complications